thank you so much for joining me today. I hope everyone here and online can hear me okay. Welcome to this panel on food security in a world of multiple crises. My name is Daisy Dunn. I'm special correspondent at Carbon Brief, which is a website that analyses and explains new developments in climate change based in the UK. So I'm very pleased to be joined by a few panelists today that are really going to be able to explain food security, the links to climate change, the science of it all. So I will quickly introduce them all. So Johan Rockström is director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, a professor at the Institute of Earth and Environmental Science at Potsdam University, and professor in water systems and global sustainability at Stockholm University. Rachel Besner-Kerr is a professor in global development at Cornell University and does research in Africa on sustainable agriculture, gender, climate change adaptation, and food security. Henry Neufeld is a Working Group 2 lead author and senior researcher at the UNEP-DTU partnership. He works primarily on transparency and leads the adaptation component of the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. Then we have Christoph Gornot, professor at University of Kassel on agroecosystem analysis and modelling and leader of PIC's working group on adaptation in agricultural systems. Dr. Sixbert Mwanga is executive director of the Climate Action Network Tanzania. And then, I think that's everyone. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Professor Rockström to make some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So this is a really important topic. We have more and more evidence of the turbulence we're facing with regards to the interactions at the global level between climate change, food insecurity, and social instability. This is really one of the major topics, not only in terms of adaptation and being able to stabilize societies around the world, but it's also one of these threats towards undermining the ability of carbon stocks, carbon sinks, and avoiding ecosystem changes that would lose even more of our ability to hold on to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. But let me start at the food security level, just as a reminder that if you look at the FAO Global Food Price Index, which tracks the relative food prices across the world food market for staple food crops, we've had 3 crises over the past 50 years. You have the oil crisis in the 1970s, where you have a peak of food prices, which was one of the big crises in the world of rapidly, exponentially rising food prices. The second one is the one that we all remember as part of the Arab Spring. We have the Tahrir Square 2011 demonstrations where people were marching on the street with one message to the world: bread, freedom, dignity. Bread, freedom, dignity. This is in itself a signal that as soon as food prices on staple foods, particularly the grains that are the basis for rice, wheat, bread production, immediately can create instabilities in societies. Today, we have the 3rd food price index spike, which comes out of the Ukraine war, with rising energy prices, natural gas deficits causing Haber-Bosch processes to just fly right through the roof. So fertilizer prices, energy prices, causing a food price index which is higher than the peak from the Arab Spring and the oil crisis. So we are actually in the deepest food price crisis since the Second World War, right as we speak. And this is hitting hard, particularly on the most vulnerable nations in the world. And we have a hotspot, which is, as we all know, the Horn of Africa. Here we have 4 consecutive rainy seasons failing. The short rains are right now. I haven't really heard the latest updates. Perhaps you have some of that updates in this panel. But this is a deep concern, where you have a sudden confluence of multiple crises hitting at the same time on the most vulnerable nations in the world, and all centered around food insecurity. So the war in Ukraine has this multiplier effect when combined with climate impacts, and its droughts and war causing food price indexes to spike and making it even more difficult for nations to cope. So that is one situation of the diagnostic of where we are today. But we also have the science here, and the science is quite clear that climate change is causing major impacts already at 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming, and victim number 1 is fresh water, and fresh water hits where? the world's largest consumer of fresh water. Our diets, if we want to have a healthy diet as an adult, for us in this room, requires something like 3 to 4 cubic meters of fresh water per person per day, which translates to roughly 1,000 cubic meters of fresh water per person per year for an adequate, healthy diet. That's the big limitation. But because water is the biggest victim number one in terms of droughts, floods, but also heat waves, because heat waves, the first thing they cause is evaporation of fresh water. You all remember the devastation in British Columbia last year with a jet stream causing meandering, creating the biggest heat wave ever recorded in British Columbia, 49.6 degrees Celsius. Well, that meant, of course, heat wave devastation for humans, but it also evaporated all the fresh water, and 2 weeks later, Lytton burnt down. This is what we're seeing as a trend line with the climate impacts impacting on water. We have more and more research connecting this with displacement, migration, and conflict. We cannot say that there is a connectivity direct between climate change, fresh water causing conflict, but what we can say today scientifically is that this is a threat amplifier. And the threat amplification goes via water and food in most of the empirical cases on the ground. So this is really a topic for us to have as an evidence in support of very rapid mitigation efforts, but also in terms of investment in what we define as climate resilience. And we have many of the resilience experts next to me on this panel, so I'll hand back to you on this one.
Thank you so much. That's a very clear explanation of climate change as a threat multiplier to the food and water crises, as you laid out. So before we move on to hear from the other speakers, we're just going to first invite you all in the room and also online to take part in a poll, a Slido poll. So you should be able to see, I hope, on the screen, a QR code that will allow you to take part in the Slido poll. So yeah, it's up there now. So the question is, climate change will make some current food production areas unsuitable. How much of our current global crop and livestock areas will become climatically unsuitable by 2100 if we keep emitting greenhouse gases at current levels? And there are 3 options for you there. So yeah, I'll give you a moment or two to vote. I think it will take a moment to appear on the screen. Are those the... okay, we can see the results coming through. Right, looks like everyone's pretty united on the answer. And I think I can say that is the correct answer, so congratulations everyone in the room. Okay, brilliant. So let's move on now to Rachel, who's going to talk to us about the Working Group 2's assessment of food security and nature-based solutions.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this. I really appreciated your introduction, Johan, because it really highlights a lot of the key findings of our report. But nonetheless, I want to share some of those key findings and then relate it to solutions that we highlight in our report based on our assessment. And one of them is what you were discussing just now is climate change impacts are already being felt there's robust observational data on the impacts that climate change is already having on our food system. It's reducing agricultural productivity growth. It's also affecting fisheries, and it's having these acute food insecurity events. So there's increasing evidence that extreme events are linked to climate change. And these extreme events, such as droughts, such as floods, such as marine heat waves, they have impacts on food prices, they have direct impacts on food productivity, and it hits the most vulnerable regions of the world most severely. So while there were extreme events in British Columbia last year, that doesn't mean people there wasn't an acute food insecurity event, but there is an acute food insecurity event happening in East Africa as a result of severe drought over 4 years. And so we know as well to the impacts on food security, that climate change is impacting the underlying ecosystems which support our food system. So it's having negative impacts on pollination and on soil health, for example, which underpin our ability to produce food in the future. So this fact about 100 years from now, we can anticipate, or less than 100, that 30% of our area of land will no longer be productive has to do with plants being able to grow under increasing heat, and also animals being able to be raised, and people being able to work in outdoor areas. And so unless we mitigate our greenhouse gases very significantly, we are going to see even more severe impacts on our food systems than are already being recorded. And we know that certain regions of the world are hotspots for being severely impacted by climate change. So sub-Saharan Africa, Central and South America, South Asia, small islands, and the Arctic are highlighted as being vulnerable to climate change impacts on food security. In addition, we know that particular groups in society are more vulnerable to food insecurity and nutrition impacts from climate change. And these vary across the world, vary by region, and vary by place. But women, children, indigenous people, racial and ethnic minorities, and low-income households, as well as smallholder producers, are more vulnerable to climate change impacts, both in terms of malnutrition and also in terms of livelihood loss and not being able to pay for food. So the price of food really makes a difference in people being able to manage in times of climate change impacts from extreme events. And Johan talked about this compounding effect of non-climatic events. So you have things like conflict that compounds and worsens climate change impacts. And it can get quite complex. So you can have multiple climate change impacts happening in a given place, which then are worsened by non-climatic events. So for example, you may see rising heat making it difficult for people to work outdoors, combined with the severe drought impacting food production, rising prices. You can have food safety issues happening all in the same place, and then combined with some sort of other shock, such as a conflict, it can lead to acute food insecurity events. And what our report highlights is that there's increasing evidence of this direct link between climate change impacts and acute food insecurity events in the scientific literature. And so there is a lot of adaptation happening, but most of it is incremental. It's not the transformational adaptation that we need in our food systems to be able to both reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to a changing climate. And the way that we grow food currently is unsustainable and is also contributing a very significant amount to our climate change problem. So in our report, we assess the literature for what solutions are there out there that can help build a resilient food system. And we found that there's a wide range of options out there for which there is strong evidence of reducing climate risk. And they also often provide many other co-benefits to society, things like food security and nutrition, things like biodiversity and livelihoods. And so I won't go into all the details, but that's the good news, is that there's a wide range of options out there for addressing climate change resilience in our food system. And many of them are ecosystem-based adaptation approaches, because currently our food system is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. It's a food system that draws on and uses fossil fuels heavily, and it depletes biodiversity by and large, the dominant food system that we currently rely on. And so the approaches that both build resilience in our food system to climate risk, but also strengthen biodiversity and the ecosystems that we rely on for our food, include things like agroecology, ecosystem-based management in fisheries, agroforestry, these other approaches that are not as commonly used, but which really will build a resilient food system going forward. And the literature also shows that currently with the Ukraine conflict, there is a push towards intensification of production. But in fact, agricultural intensification, so increased use of fossil fuel-based inputs, in the short term, it increases production, but it actually threatens the underlying food system by having ecosystem degradation impacts and often displacing local food producers who rely on local food production for their livelihoods. And so in the end, it can worsen the food security in the region, and overall it has negative impacts on ecosystems. And so agricultural intensification is sort of the go-to strategy globally when there's a food crisis, but in fact, it puts us in a dangerous position in the long run. One of the overarching messages from our report is the importance of addressing social inequalities in food systems if we are to really ensure that we have a resilient food system. And so this means involving marginalized groups in the solutions and really drawing on local and indigenous knowledge for the solutions that we want to use for adaptation, not only in terms of carrying out processes in fields and farms and communities, but in the governance of how those adaptation solutions are rolled. I think I just got, okay, there, I'm back. Just focusing on technical adaptation strategies alone is likely to worsen the position of those marginalized groups. And there's lots of evidence in the scientific literature that only focusing on technical solutions is really not for food security. They didn't like that in the ether world. So we also found that integrated solutions that really are multi-sectoral and inclusive are really crucial for these kind of long-term building of resilient food systems. So for example, capacity building of smallholders in these agroecological approaches combined with community grain banks, so you have better regional food systems support, farmer cooperatives, so they have local markets, and public procurement, so that a more diverse range of foods is then fed into local schools for school feeding programs, for example. So these kind of combination of strategies that help build a long-term resilient local and regional food system is really essential if we're going to have this transformational strategy that we really need in our food system. Just a final note that this is from my own research. This isn't an IPCC report finding, but this paper was cited in the report as evidence that agroecological approaches can really improve food security and nutrition. Not just one practice, not just one agroecological practice, but a combination of practices combined with this inclusive approach is what leads to improved food security and nutrition. So with that, I am going to pass it back to Daisy and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear about how marginalised groups are disproportionately affected, but also can be a key part of the solution. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on now to Henry, who's going to talk a bit about food security and the bioeconomy. So take it away.
Yes, thanks a lot. So part of the food security, food, feed, bio, and ecosystem product chapter that Rachel was leading was this cross-working group box on the bioeconomy. And this box is replicated in both reports, the Working Group 2 report and the Working Group 3 report. And with this, I'll take this beyond the food system, because in reality, what we're dealing with is a crisis of land resources, or actually also ocean resources. So if you look at the left-hand side, you can see how much of our land is still sort of wilderness, and that's less than a third. Just 50 years ago, it was nearly 2/3. So over this period of 50 years, we have transformed a large part of our ice-free land, this is only focusing on land, into productive lands in one way or the other. And with population growth, urbanization, growth in demands, these really big drivers we can assume that the pressure on nature is just going to grow as we progress. And we certainly need to do something about it, because not only is there growing demand for food, there is a growing demand for bioproducts, which is what we need to think about. There is a growing demand for mitigation using natural resources. There is a growing demand for bioproducts that we use in construction, we use for our industrial processes, you name it. It goes everywhere. And this growing demand needs to be met with using less natural resources. And we've just heard very clearly that climate change is also going to affect the productivity of the remaining land resources. So if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that the way we're dealing with this triple crisis of climate change, land degradation and ocean degradation, if you want to, and then connected to that biodiversity loss is leading significantly to reduced human well-being. We need to turn this whole thing around if we want to have a sustainable production going forward. Sorry. And if we look at this slide here, roughly at least half of the mitigation potential that is inland is actually by not using it. Where we are using it, we have to restore it. We have to be careful with our management system. We can reduce emissions there. And we can need to protect the existing land because it's a vital carbon sink that is critical to the mitigation outcomes that we're all striving for. So that's what this bioeconomy box was trying to deal with. And I'll talk a little bit about the, I think, 5 solutions, sort of really important things in order to what we need to do here. First of all, increase productivity. We need to increase productivity, and that can be done not only by increasing, the inputs, which is one way of doing it, but we can increase the value of our bioproducts. In, let's say, we produce furniture or wood for construction, which is then transformed later into other products. This form of productivity increase adds value to the bioeconomy. And that reduces also the amount of waste. It increases the circular economy that we need to strive for. Dietary change towards healthier foods, absolutely critical to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of particularly livestock systems. And, it really does produce better outcomes in terms of health for the people. This is mainly talking about the developed world. Of course, in developing countries, we find situations where people need to eat more proteins, and that in some cases may involve eating more livestock. So, we have to be careful here with our messaging. Third, an agroecological transformation of agricultural lands, the restoration of degraded lands, and marine resources, and the protection of ecosystems. I don't need to talk much about the agroecological system because Rachel did that just now. It's very clear. These systems produce, in many cases, they have higher productivity rates, particularly in low production systems. In high production systems, that's not always the case. And in those cases, we will have to face the fact that as a result of this agroecological transformation of our agricultural lands, we will have lower production in these areas because ultimately, if it's not produced in an agroecological form, it is not sustainable long term. Fourth, innovation in novel bioproducts across a wide range of sectors. I'm talking about moving a lot of the bioproduction out of the land or the ocean systems into factories. We need to take these systems out of the land to free up that land for protection and restoration in order to produce these ecosystem services that we all rely on for our well-being. And, cellular agriculture, fungi, algae, there is a huge range of products that can be produced with novel technologies, and I think this is a huge area of innovation also for growth in a sustainable way. And of course, these things do produce or require more energy. Now, if we produce these things with fossil fuels, that's wrong. We need to use the increasing electrification of our societies and the increasing demand for renewable energies to produce these bioproducts in that form. And ultimately, lastly, global governance of trade and multilateralism. I think this is a really tricky area. I think, global trade does tend to buffer price volatilities, and in that form, it can be considered a form of adaptation, but it also produces these price hikes and shocks, and we need to be careful about that. So developing a multilateral system and a global governance system that takes account of these potential shocks is absolutely critical. When supply chains disrupts, that's when we get these price hikes. And at the same time, we have to be aware that a lot of the deforestation, land degradation that we can experience and we see all over the world is actually driven by our demands in the developed world. So finding solutions here that involve key stakeholders on the ground, connect local producers to global markets, but making sure that these connections are sustainable through multilateral systems is absolutely critical. And I think that's where I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to hear you talk about dietary change in the developed world, which I think is so key to food, climate and land discussions, but not something I've seen that much discussion around in COP27 so far. So thank you. Before we move on to our final two speakers, we have another poll for you to take part in, if you feel up for doing it. So you look on the screen there, you've got another QR code. And the question is, besides carbon sequestration, agroecological practices can also ... and then you can pick your answer. And in a few moments, I'm sure the results will start loading on the screen.
A, B, C, D.
Fun.
Okay, improves soil fertility. Okay, so we've got a lot of people voting for the different answers here. That's interesting. Cool, very interesting to see. So I think the answer could be any of those options. So I think, yeah, it's quite normal to see a kind of spread in that question. So I'm going to turn now to Christoph, who's going to talk about resilient agricultural systems. So go for it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, can you go to my slides also?
Oh, sorry.
Oh. Here we are. Yeah, perfect. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for being here. And I have the privilege also to discuss a bit on, in the end, how can we create climate resilient agriculture systems? So what is needed for this? And I think we have heard already from Johan and from Rachel what is on stake. And I think it's so important to know that we have these food systems here already, and they are producing food, but we also have these big problems with food insecurity. We have heard about the crisis in Eastern Africa. We have the crisis in Madagascar. And I think it's so important to make sure that we don't play these against each other. So climate change ambitions and also food insecurity. And I think here we should focus on how we bring climate information of the climate system, information of the agriculture system into action. And I think that's very important because I think we have heard already, and the IPCC is a brilliant example that there is so many knowledge already there. And the big question is how to bring this into action, how to implement all these knowledge which we have at the table. Of course, we also need more information, and we also have to understand certain impacts of climate change better. But I think here at the COP, it's really the debate on making action out of this. And here we have the focus on considering aspects of costs and benefits which should be considered, which are important for smallholder farmers in particular. If they want to invest, they have to see a certain benefit in this. And we have legal aspects, we have aspects of land tenure, which is often not solved in many small island states and many developing countries where we have big problems, and we have to integrate the society in these loops. So without the smallholder farmers, without the buy-in of the farmers, of the society, we will not manage this. And I think that's so important to acknowledge this and to consider this also in the process, also making sure how we can bring scientific knowledge, scientific evidence into implementation. And of course, we still have our uncertainty in the models, in our assessments which we do, and we also have to acknowledge this, but it's so important that we don't wait until the last piece of uncertainty is solved. We don't have time anymore. We have to bring this into implementation. And I think that's very often the debate. It's people arguing that, of course, there is some uncertainty. Yes, there is, but of course, it's also time to act right now. And I think in particular in the frame of the NDCs and the NUPs, we see also that there's more scientific information needed to implement them and to bring them into action. I just wanted to give one very concrete example, which we did in Western Africa, in Burkina Faso, where we focused on an agroecological measure, the so-called SAI technology, which is a measure to improve the soil. And it turned also out that we have big benefits also when these measures are implemented. We can almost triple crop yields, and we can also have very positive effects on the costs and the benefits, so that farmers making a real revenue out of this. And I think this is very important, this revenue that the farmers could make. And we also see that there's a high uptake of the farmers, that they are interested in these measures. And only then, with this ownership which comes from the south, I think we can solve this issue. We have talked about already, Rachel has mentioned this, transformational adaptation. And I think here we also see that we have a complex system, and I think we have to see the system as an entire big complex system which interacts with each other. We cannot focus on a single measure and hope to solve this with a single measure. I think this is also, we have to acknowledge that the system interacts, and I think that's also key. My take-home messages for this, I think we have a lot of knowledge already there, and we have to bring this scientific evidence into the processes at the policy level. And we also have to acknowledge that there is a big gap in adaptation planning, and there more evidence is in the end needed. It needs regional and local solution, and it needs to be together with the smallholder farmers, because we face quite different effects around the globe. And I think it's also so important to acknowledge that these effects are different and that they need adjusted, tailor-made solutions in the end. Capacity building is very important in this aspect, and only doing so we can create a resilient agriculture system. And I think this is already mentioned, the participatory process, engaging all different entities, institutions, will help to solve this problem. And I think that's among researchers, also what IPCC is already doing, but also interaction with policy and science is much more needed to get a real impact in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear about how this is a complex area, but the need to take action is very urgent and very real. So moving on now to our final speaker, Sixbert, who's going to talk about climate risks and adaptation challenges for small-scale farmers in Tanzania. So please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much. I think I just wanted to, first of all, go back to the real challenges which are facing the smallholder farmers or the communities, especially in the areas of food production. As my colleagues mentioned, it's one of the prolonged and the frequent. First of all, it is prolonged, and then it is frequent, all the time coming up. Drought, which is especially in some of the places which are even out in the mainland, and then when it comes to the coast, with an example of Tanzania, then the business changes. They have prolonged drought, and then they have the sea level rise. We have some good examples in Tanzania, especially in Zanzibar, where most of the farms have been taken by the ocean. So farmers can no longer cultivate or grow anything because the whole land is already taken. And then there is a question of, so the drought also, again, comes the issue of the going down of the soil fertility. So they can no longer grow anything because of drought, and then the land, the whole land becomes unfertile. Then the good question of the agroecology, then of recently there has been a very serious shift of agroecological zones. So the land which used to maybe to be favorable for, let's say, for millet, it is no longer. Even if it favors millet, then there's the question of ever-increasing diseases and tsetse flies and whatever then coming up. And then, but then that happens at the moment where there is no enough extension services. So the farmers don't necessarily know what to do and all this together. And even if there is extension services, there is a question of accessing quality needed crops or seeds to grow in the farms and all this together. Then there's a question of timing, when to grow, what to grow, and there's something of that kind. So the work that we have been doing is more linked to that, to addressing some of those challenges. One of our projects spent much time promoting what the integrated and participatory climate services, where we really work with the farmers to bring them at the center to decide and then bring what comes from the Met Authority and what comes from themselves. What type of crops to grow, when and how, like all this together, what could be the timing and all this together. And then there's the question of trying to see what could be the crop water requirement, because with all this drought, then you shouldn't be expecting, if you grow maize which needs such amount of water, and then there is no much water, and then you should expect all this loss. And then there's a question of access to finance. Then are the banks ready and available to invest into those communities? Of recently, I should say no. Then the communities themselves now trying to empower them to to contribute what they have, to promote, to enhance what they call the village community bank. If you like, you can also call them the community village bank. The name might change depending on, maybe it might be also the farmers community bank, depending on what you want to address and who are the people coming up all together. Then trying now to bring again to work with the extension workers beyond the normal extension workers we know. So trying to there could be a farmer who is not necessarily trained to be extension worker, but has such a diverse and a very useful knowledge which could really address the work and address the food security issue and the climate which is really going on. Then with all this, then there has been a question of where the running water, the fresh water, water from the rivers are no longer flowing. Then there is a question of utilizing underground water. But then we are in developing countries. Much of the farms are not nearby the grid. Then I think my colleagues mentioned the question of promoting renewable energy now, and in this regard, probably enhancing the role of solar irrigation in the whole equation, and that's what we have been doing. And for me, if you were to look at most of the African submitted NDCs, most of them they are promoting adaptation. And if you look at them critically, you will find that at least 10 to 14 sectors are really linked to food security in one way or another, even if it is health. It has to do with the food and what you eat and when it was promoted and the storage issues and all this together. I'm of view that if we were to enhance the implementation now of the already submitted NDCs, I'm sure that we can achieve a lot, and probably we can then try to address the question of food crisis, especially at the moment where climate change is already adding up a lot of burdens to our farmers. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Before we hand over to the Q&A for the audience, I just thought I would ask each of you to answer a question, first of all. So if you could see one key advancement from COP27 that would really kind of address the food, climate, land crises, what would it be? So maybe I can ask you each in turn. So Johan, do you want to answer first?
I think that what was actually agreed already in Glasgow with the pledge to halt deforestation 30% by 2030, and this was a coalition of the nations hosting the largest parts of the remaining intact forest areas in the world, would be a fundamental step forward. Because what has come across very clearly, which I fully support in this panel, is also that different forms of sustainable intensification is absolutely required. We cannot continue expanding agriculture into the, well, what is it now, 30-40% of the remaining areas on planet Earth that are still intact nature. So I think that is something to recognize, that you have a double win by investing in sustainable, regenerative or sustainable intensification, because you both secure carbon sinks in intact nature and you build resilient in agricultural systems. So that, I think, would be the number one, and that would require some form of financial mechanism to value the carbon in intact nature, but also value the carbon built in agricultural systems.
Okay, thank you. Rachel?
It's nice to dream that we can have our wishes come true. I mean, for me, it's hard to choose because it's so critical that mitigation happens in a much more significant way than has been happening so far. So I think that would be my number one wish, that governments really step up and agree and follow through on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, because the evidence is so clear that if that doesn't happen, we are in for so much more severe impacts, not only in food systems, but in many other systems. But if I had a second bit of dream come true, it would be around that they also step up for investing in adaptation in the global south in a very significant way, because just not enough has been put on the table. And of course, the global south is being hit the hardest in terms of impacts, and that includes the food system. So it's a very general thing, but for me, it's like really getting serious about mitigation, which is not happening enough, and it's not happening fast enough, and really following through on adaptation promises and increasing dramatically the amount that is put on the table to support the global south.
Thank you. Henry?
Yes, thanks. Well, Rachel, you already took the finance one, of course. So, in my day job, among other things, I edit the adaptation gap reports, and one of the key findings of this year's report, as of last year's report also, is that the gap between adaptation costs today and the future and adaptation flows, this gap is 5 to 10 times the adaptation flows of international adaptation finance. And this gap is widening, I would say. So it's pretty clear that we need a lot more adaptation finance to happen. And at the same time, we need much better adaptation action. One of the other findings, key findings of this year's report is that our adaptation action is very, very poor, and it needs to improve. There are some really critical and simple, actually, principles that if we follow those, adaptation action can become much more effective. Among those is looking into the future when designing our current actions. Right now, most of our actions are actually incremental, as Rachel mentioned, and focusing exclusively on today. They do not take into account future climate change, and if we adapt in that way, we'll probably end up with a lot of maladaptation at the same time. One additional point I'd like to make, and this is the first time that during the COP development that loss and damage has taken center stage. I think it's very clear that developing countries are demanding real progress on loss and damage, and that is, in the context of food security, a really important demand because we already committed ourselves to more residual climate risk, which will ultimately transform into higher impacts. Losses and damages are the results of that. Adaptation can reduce the costs significantly, clearly, but there are going to be more losses and damages, and we need to find a solution to providing particularly developing countries, but everybody's really going to be hit, let's face that, with more ways of avoiding dropping deeper into the debt crises, locking themselves into a spiral of that just goes down. And providing the resources here is absolutely critical. Thanks.
Thank you, Christoph.
Well, not much left on the wish list, I guess. But I would just, to underline what you have said, I think we have to focus on the mitigation, but we also have to prepare that mitigation alone will not solve this. We have to also invest in adaptation. I also wanted to mention the adaptation gap which we have, and I think this needs finance mechanisms on all levels. So what Sixbert mentioned before, and I think we also need these local finance mechanisms to also enable smallholder farmers to get access to funding, to implement in the end what they have on their wish list. But also we need also international finance mechanisms, and there also the GCF has to come into play to reduce these adaptation gaps which we still have and which we still see in the international finance situation. And I think it's also important, that's also why I wanted to mention this, we will also, with focusing on mitigation, on adaptation, this will also not be enough. There will be also a certain share where we have limits of adaptation and where we cannot longer adapt to. And I guess also we have to prepare for this, and this is also very important, and this is definitively linked to what is under the umbrella of loss and damages, and where we also have to prepare our communities to also face these kind of results and get also finance mechanisms to compensate these kind of losses and damages in the agriculture sector.
Thank you, Sixbert.
Yeah, thanks. So as I said earlier, most of the NDCs submitted by the Global South have appreciated the fact that adaptation is of more important, and so the number one call could be now to reach a point where the 50-50 finance both on adaptation and mitigation comes to existence, and we feel the gap itself. And for me, I don't really care when it comes to supporting adaptation. If the question is, what is it that you bring on the table, and whether it's finance, whether it's technology, whether it's capacity building, it's very important. I just wanted to mention that the rate where the impacts are increasing in the continent or in the globe south is such much higher compared to the speed, like how we are taking time to learn on how to adapt itself. So we might want to run even faster, especially in the knowledge kind of and developing the skills on how to address the impacts themselves. And also, I think the question of special circumstances, and like the proposal by the African group of negotiators, and for me, for the communities themselves, that the adaptation shouldn't be like you just say, or whether mitigation should be the same in all wherever all over the globe, but it should be spatial, and even in the way we act, we should be specific, and also we should consider the special circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you. So we're going to open the floor to questions now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I think a mic will travel towards you. So if you could just say your name, your affiliation, and then your question, if you have a person to direct it towards. That's also fine. So you start in the front here.
My name is...
Sorry, I think is there? Oh, sorry.
Hello? Check 1 2, check 1 2. Thank you. So my name is Ingrid Jacobsen from Bread for the World, and here was said that the wish list is almost empty now, but I have much more things on the wish list. So I think about the general approach. So I think we need a kind of human rights, not kind of, but we need a human rights approach. We have to look for the right to food, the right to water, because if you look who should implement at the end, we can't expect from poor farmers, poor families, to look at climate first. They live from hand to mouth, so one has to look that everybody can fulfill the basic needs, and this has to go along with climate protection. So I think we have to look at social disparities also. We have to look at social security networks, and all this must be added. I would like to add it on the wish list, and I see it's not very widespread here. If we look at right to food, food sovereignty, I don't see it here at the moment, and I think this is, it's important.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment on human rights and the importance of... Yeah, Rachel?
Yeah, I can comment on that. Oh, I don't need the mic. I have one. I forgot. Thank you. That's a really important comment. And in the IPCC report, we did discuss rights-based approaches to food. But right now in the scientific literature, because our report has to draw on peer-reviewed scientific literature, there isn't a lot of literature that directly links climate change impacts and adaptation to rights-based approaches. And so we did discuss that linkage. There is a little bit of literature, and I think that there is a growing interest in making these direct connections between human rights and rights-based approaches and climate change adaptation within food systems. But I agree that there is a disconnect sometimes between these two concepts.
Great. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, definitely there's, you could add all these points, and I fully agree. I think this is also what I tried to summarize in my presentation, that I said, okay, we have a quite complex system and we have to consider a lot of aspects. Definitely I have not mentioned all of them, but also the aspect of that the farmers working in smallholder context often don't have the right to farm on their land. It's also, I think, a very important aspect which we have to consider. And I think it's often not fully understood on how the tenure situation, for instance, enables or disables farmers to invest in their land. And this in turn is again linked to food security and insecurity, and I guess we have to acknowledge that we work here in this very complex system, and some of the chains are so far not fully understood from a scientific point of view.
Thank you.
I can just say that. So I'm not questioning the agenda on human rights of food, but I think one has to recognize that it's you have to problematize it much further than it comes across if you just push for human rights for food, because what we're ultimately talking about, I think, is not human rights for food access, because that becomes a kind of a reactive World Food Program type global situation. What we want is to build the capacity of local communities to produce their own food and to be more food independent. So the whole social resilience of food communities has to do with having the human right to a stable environment. So you want to have a stable freshwater system, good temperatures, your rainy seasons, but also productive soils. So fundamentally, I think, even if perhaps the word human rights has not been used here, I think it addresses at one level upstream what we mean by justice. I mean, the ultimate definition of human justice today is a stable climate. I mean, that to me is what can provide and enable stable livelihoods and production of food. So if one, because I think politically there's a risk that human rights to food becomes handouts of food, and that we don't want. Mm-hmm. Of course, but I'm just saying that politically it may be interpreted wrongly in that way. So I think putting in the human rights from a resilience or very much from that social livelihoods perspective, I think is a very good way of addressing it.
Very quickly, I think, when we develop these adaptation, implementation actions, which I mentioned, are really poor as they are being implemented today, a central element of improving them is co-ownership and co-development of actions. And that goes beyond the food system, but of course, when it's about smallholder farmers, trying to avoid the risks that they might face because of heat, drought, flood risk in their production systems, developing something without their co-development is going to lead to long-term unsustainable solutions. I would go to the point to say that this element of a climate-just transition to more sustainable agroecological systems is critical. It's essential, actually, to a stable climate. Everything else will not result in these kind of outcomes.
Mm.
Okay, great. We'll take another question. The man in second row.
Thank you. Richard Betts from the Met Office Hadley Centre, University of Exeter. Thank you, panel, for a fabulous set of talks and insights. So Christoph mentioned limits to adaptation, and Sixbert gave a great example at the farm level of sort of farmers in Zanzibar losing land to the sea. My question is, what do we know about limits to adaptation in the food system at large scales, country or continent or global scales? So I guess this is initially to Christoph, but I'm sure others on the panel will have some thoughts. I'd be interested to hear what Johan thinks from a planetary boundaries perspective, for example.
Hey, Christoph.
If I may. So yeah, thanks for the question. And I think that's very important. And we definitively see a certain gap also in the literature, which is really focusing on the production side. But what you described as having the full value chain is often not that precisely covered in a way on a local level and also on an international or subnational level. And I think here it's very important to understand each component of the value chain, and also to understand on how could we make them more resilient. So it will not help if we only make the production more resilient if we have then the losses further in the chain. And I think what comes to your question with respect to the limits of adaptation, that's also often very critical in a way that, of course, farmers, producers, whatever kind of companies working in the food value chain they create their income, their livings on this, and if this is once lost, it's often really hard, in particular on a local level, to bring this back. So how could we make sure that once the infrastructure is there, the knowledge is there, and if this is once interrupted or lost for certain years, then it will be really hard to establish this again. And so this is also some kind of no return in this way, or non-reversible in this way.
Okay, Jonah?
Yeah, so thanks. So just a few different answers to your question there. I mean, number one, just to point you to, we had a press conference earlier today when we launched the 2022 version of the 10 new insights in climate science, which we do every year together with the World Climate Research Program, the Earth League, and Future Earth. And one of the top 10 there is the limits to adaptation, really looking at the hotspot regions in the world, and I'm just pointing you to that. So if you Google 10 NICs, 10 new insights in climate science, it kind of supports exactly the statement that Christoph gave. Secondly, just a very personal note, in my earlier background of doing research in Tanzania and in Kenya, we found quite a lot of evidence that farming communities cross tipping points of abandoning farming much earlier than what hydrology and ecology would suggest. And the reason is, of course, risk management. They simply don't want to take the risk of the labor costs, the seed costs, the fertilizer costs. So you tend to abandon in Tanzania the long rains, for example, much earlier than hydrologically would be proposed. And this is a real concern, that you get social tipping points occurring earlier perhaps than biophysical tipping points, because poor communities don't want to risk the little capital they have. And I'm curious also if there's more evidence on this, but that was just one of the field experiences that we had. But then on planetary boundaries, well, actually together with colleagues at the Potsdam Institute, led by Dieter Gerten, they published a paper just 2 years back showing that if we only care about planetary boundaries, if we only care about a stable planet, I mean 1.5 degrees Celsius on climate, but also the planetary boundary on nitrogen, on phosphorus, on land and biodiversity and freshwater, we could only feed 3.5 billion people today. You can just imagine how unsustainable the global food system is. But that paper also showed that if we do what was presented here in terms of investing in regenerative, sustainable intensification, I mean, practices we actually know quite well, from agroforestry to soil and water conservation, we can very likely feed up to 10 billion people within planetary boundaries, but it requires a completely different agricultural system. So we are in a real severe fix in that sense.
Sixbert, do you want to add anything?
No,
Okay. Any?
I mean, in our report, we talk about limits to adaptation within the food system, and we had the citation, we were tested earlier on our knowledge, but in terms of crops, there are hard limits to adaptation with heat and water stress, making it not possible to grow some crops in some regions of the world, depending on where we go with temperature warming. But there's also limits in terms of raising animals. So we document the literature around heat stress, making it very difficult to raise animals, and that's a very serious limit to adaptation. And humans being able to work outdoors. You know, farming is an outdoor activity for many parts of the world, and for particular, you know, fruits and vegetables, for example. So heat stress is a very real limit, physical limit to adaptation for people. And that goes to your point, Johan, that people may decide, I no longer want to work as a farm worker in this place. I can't bear the thought of working outdoors in, 45, 50 degree temperatures. And so I'm going to move my family. I'm not going to use this as my livelihood anymore. It's too exploitative, too difficult, too tough working conditions. So yes, there is increasing literature on limits to adaptation in those three areas in particular, less on the kind of social limits, the soft limit literature that you refer to in food systems, but I think that's a very important feature to take into account as well.
Okay. Do we have more questions? Gentleman in the front.
Thank you very much. So we heard a lot about adaptation today, but I think there's also a lot to talk about what countries can do that actually cause most of the damage. And I really want to mention Germany here, for example. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Maximilian Weiss from the Plant-Based Treaty Initiative. I'm also from Germany. And I really want to mention Germany as an example for a food system gone completely wrong, where we use approximately 2/3 of the grain that's grown there to feed animals. And I was really excited to see the Potsdam Institute issue a report earlier this year calling for radical food system transformation. But really, when we're talking about animal agriculture, I see a pattern of whether it's food security, climate change, biodiversity, freshwater use. We're not talking about it. Like, we're simply not mentioning it. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, I think you're right, of course, about the fact that 60% or more of food production is going into animal feed, and it's driving deforestation in Brazil and other places, as an example. At the same time, the transition toward an agroecological agriculture in Germany, elsewhere, actually requires livestock, because if you do not rely on fossil fuel fertilizers to replenish soil fertility, you are mining the soils. And the soils are the basis for, you need healthy soils to produce crops. So we need to find a way to integrate livestock into our agroecological system. They are critical there. So, I definitely see the need for, in developed countries, in rich countries, to change to a more plant-based diet to reduce the food waste. That also is a form of productivity gain. But at the same time, I also, really want to stress that livestock is an integral part of an agroecological system. And we need to build that into our transition toward these systems.
Well, just to build on that, they're integrating livestock into an agroecological system does mean reducing the amount of meat consumption that happens globally, and particularly in the global north, and moving away from industrial livestock production. So I agree with you. It's not being discussed enough because industrial livestock production is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and is also promoting unhealthy diets, and those diets are too heavy in meat consumption. And Germany is similar to North America in that we, as a population as a whole, consume far more meat than we should be for our own health. So it's affecting our health, and it's also affecting the planet. And so I think the literature is clear in showing that to be able to transition to a sustainable food system, we need to shift our diets. And it will vary a lot depending on whether you're in Tanzania or you're in North America or you're in Germany. But certainly, I think the evidence is very strong that reducing industrial livestock production, changing the way we raise livestock very fundamentally, and changing the way we eat will be a crucial part of transitioning to a sustainable food system.
Yeah, so for me, I think in the context of like a local farmer, first of all, the livestock, they are not necessarily enjoying what comes from the farms themselves. But then the question is the competition on the land itself, the water itself, and all this together. And those are the reasons why we have the conflict between the farmers and the pastoralists. The question is, should we use the land to grow crops, or we use land to keep animals and all this together, and what type of animal and of what quality and the quantity as well. So with all these things brought together, then that's a very serious issue to address. And I think one of the difficult question, which is especially in the global south, which has remained unanswered, is if I keep my cattle well and safely and they don't pollute the environment, will I get more, like when I take them to the market, am I going to get more resources, or will be the same, no one cares? And that is still challenging, and I think, yeah, which might need to be answered. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, John's one there.
Hello, my name is Fernando.
Not really.
Hello.
You have to scream.
There you go. Hello, my name is Fernando from Mexico. Thank you very much for your presentation. And sometimes it's really, really hard for me to keep being optimistic. I was in the World Economic Forum, and right now hearing all these like wish lists, but I have done the math and it does not work too good. So yeah, as you were saying, Johan, probably the limits of the Earth are way too low, like, I don't know, 3.5 billion people. The tendencies, we're going to be 10 billion in 2050, and we want the Earth to be healthy, but we also want human rights, and we also want I don't know, too many things. Probably we have become too ambitious. And my final question for the panelists would be, seriously, like very, very honestly, do you still optimistic about if all these goals can be achieved, like really realistically? Thanks.
Interesting. Who wants to kick off with that one? Yeah, go for it.
You're going to go first, Henry?
Yeah, why not? I don't know if optimistic is the right word. I'm hopeful that we will be able to get there. I believe, this is a critical time in our global history. The next 30 years, I think, will be absolutely fundamental to decide whether we're going to be doomed or we're actually going to manage this quite well. We have the tools, right? We've got all the tools. We've got enormous amounts of innovation and capacity to do things. Critical to achieving our outcomes really is collaborative approaches, climate justice, and all the associated forms of that come together with managing land more sustainably. And I want to go back to the innovation of food systems. What Johan was talking about is related to our current production systems on the land. And I believe we have not explored sufficiently the productivity gains we can achieve by taking a lot of that bioproduction out of the land and doing it in an industrial scale. This is a way of reducing the pressure on our natural resources, of increasing nature, restoring nature to provide the ecosystem services we need to thrive. So I think that's a critical new, development that we need to pursue, and I'm very hopeful that goes forward in the right way. I mean, it's important to manage this properly. Let's not be, naive about it. This is a private sector-driven process, and it needs to be managed properly. It needs the right governance structures to ensure that it doesn't become really lead to bad outcomes, climate injustice, inequity. That's also a possibility. So we need to be sure that we have the governance structures, national, global, local, in place, but innovation and technological development absolutely critical.
Do you want to add anything?
So, well, to begin with, at least from my perspective, it would be dishonest not to be very, let's say, honest with you to say that I think we are seeing this is a very gloomy outlook where we are right now. And that gloomy outlook is a combination between the risk analysis, which is putting us, placing us closer and closer to really damaging impacts, but also irreversible changes. But I think it's important to, and then the other negative side of this is that we have a geopolitical instability in the world, we have mistrust in the world, we have a low appetite to really act, despite on the fact that there's a very wide scientific consensus on the crisis we're in. I think it's important to kind of distinguish between different buckets of what explains whether or not we have a chance to solve this or not. And the first bucket is the necessity. And here it's clear. I mean, it's necessary to decarbonize the world economy. It's necessary to keep intact nature intact. It is necessary to come in within the safe operating space on planetary boundaries. And that is the necessity part. And then the next bucket is it possible to meet the necessity? And I agree. It is. We have the solutions in the toolbox. It's quite interesting to say that the food system transition, the energy transition, the two number one, I mean, putting it a little bit simplistically, but if we solve the energy transition, the food transition, the remaining is in the footnotes. These are the two big line items. So it is possible. The third bucket is what's the outcomes if you do these two things, and we have more and more scientific evidence, I mean really strong evidence, that the outcomes is a healthier, more stable, more resilient, actually even more modern, economically thriving. I mean there's a reason for having a double frustration today that we're not acting on the necessity when we have evidence of having a more positive outcome if we push it. So that's the problem with the fourth bucket, which is what is feasible in the world of today. And it's that bucket which is kind of tearing us down. So when The Economist in today's issue says goodbye to 1.5, I totally disagree with it because they mix the buckets. 1.5 is a physical limit. It's a necessary point for a safe landing to be able to deliver on everything we've been discussing today. It's possible. It's very likely possible. And it gives better outcomes. But when you put the final bucket on your assessment on the political reality of the world, of course you go down. But that's a moving target. So I think one should be having this distinguishing between different components of what is the reason why we are pessimistic. And I would argue today we're not pessimistic because we don't have the solutions or because we can't have a better outcome. We're pessimistic because we don't believe that the big economies in the world are really, really going to deliver on what they've promised. And that's what we need to help them with, gently, but quite decisively.
Very gently. Yeah, I agree that the picture looks very bleak. If you want to say in this way, of course, there's not much time left and we have to act now. But I think I would also frame this, maybe not hopeful is definitively a good word to describe this, saying, okay, there's so much on stake. What we have is everything on stake. The existence of our human well-being is on stake, and we have to work on this right now to make sure that we reach the goals which we have set to us. And I think, there's no other option in my point of view. And as the previous speakers has already mentioned, the options are already there, and I would not put too much. I mean, we will also have technical solutions which will help and which will be developed in the future. But of course, we could not build our future on development invented in the future. So I would definitively also take what we already have, where we have shown in the past that this works, that there are systems which work in a resilient way, and we have to bring this together with knowledge creation. And I think then, we could manage this way.
Rachel, anything?
Do you want all of us to answer that question? I mean, you put the blame on population, but I actually look to the small percentage of polluters, the wealthiest, to call to task for the crisis that we're in. I mean, that's what the scientific evidence shows, that it's not the poor majority, but it's the wealthy majority that are the big minority, the wealthy minority, thank you, that are the big cause of the problem. And so I do feel hopeful when I look at the scientific evidence. There are so many options out there. I also feel hopeful when I visit my Malawian smallholder farmer who's doing amazing things despite being, very limited in her resources. I also feel hopeful when I visit French sheep farmers who are doing these innovative sheep grazing in conservation areas and keeping wildfire risks down. I feel hopeful when I visit American farmers who are also doing amazing ecological farming using solar grazing methods. So I see many, many options out there that we already know about and that people are already doing. And where I think we have to look is the political will to push governments to make changes. And that's why we need diverse voices in the room. We need democratization of these decision making to push governments to take action, even though there's strong vested interests that don't want those actions to take place. And that's that wealthy minority. So I think it behooves all of us to really keep pushing politically, because that is that bucket that makes us feel bleak when we see the trajectory of political systems going in the very wrong direction rather than in the direction towards taking action.
Can I just add to that? One thing that's really giving me a lot of hope is the fact that there are so many young people here. I mean, the youth movement at this COP, I mean, I wasn't at COP 26, but it's amazing, really. And the way youth is articulating their demands and making it very clear that it is their future that we are, missing, and we are failing our future, our children, the future generations with what we're doing. And this is our moral obligation, really. This is what we need to get right. But the youth movement here is just amazing, and really that's what gives me most hope. Thanks.
Yeah, so just to add on what the previous speakers have said, I think I have an impression that especially in the Global South, we haven't also done a lot. We haven't, we are living in the world where we still think we have abundant. I wouldn't expect everyone being a farmer. Why everyone should be a farmer? And you cultivate it here today, then tomorrow you are there, and then all this together. And this has something to do with the way the government own and handle all these things. And I think there should be another movement which has to do with the shifting the mindset that you can still remain in the same farm, you grow the crops, there could be the technology, and then those who have the technology should bring the technology itself. So we should be in a point where those who are in need, they meet those who have it, and then they do the thing together, and then they produce a lot. If you were to look at how much is wasted, the food which is wasted in rural areas where there is no roads, they grew the whatever, the fruits, vegetables, and whatever, and then it rains, the roads are cut off, and then they have no power, they have nothing, and then everything gets off. And then the next year, they have, in a few days, they have to grow again because they need to feed they are not connected to where the food is needed, to the nearby towns. And then what is coming from towns going to where the food is grown, it's almost nothing. The prices and all this together, I think when we address all this, and that's why maybe my colleagues also talked about the integrated kind of system and the approaches and the participatory kind of work. So all these things could always bring the answers. And for me, I would continue respecting what the science is saying, and I wouldn't be afraid. I would even need more data to, thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
More.
Gentleman at the back.
Hello, Larry Moffat with Press Club Brussels Europe. The European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, which is the biggest funding program, it's I think more than a third of the Europe's budget, seems to me to go completely against everything that you're advocating. It's subsidizing intensive agriculture, heavy use of fertilizer, pesticides, monoculture, export-driven, massive meat production. So if you could redesign it completely, how would you go about it, and how long would it take to undo the damage and get on the right track?
I'll jump on that first, and then my European colleagues can take over. But there was a great report that came out, I think, 2 years ago that modeled 10 years to transition Europe to an agroecological system. And they have some really good numbers showing that it is possible to do. That definitely means changing the subsidy program so that it's no longer supporting the climate change impacts, and instead is transitioning to a diversified agroecological farming system. And they estimated that it would reduce greenhouse gases by, I think, 35%. It would reduce productivity, but they would still be able to meet their trade and food security requirements, and partly through shifting diets, partly through addressing food waste, and partly through changing the economy to strengthen the agroecological products that are coming out of farming systems. So that's what I would recommend. But I think it would take 10 years, according to this study, which is produced by a French institute, if you're interested. So there is some literature out there.
Any final brief remarks? We've only got about a minute left. So.
Yeah, I feel quite comfortable with this topic. I think pillar one of the CAP is the problem that you're addressing, and there's pillar two, which talks which uses more agroecological production systems, but it's not about production. So if I were to have a say, which I don't, of course, but I think it would make a lot of sense to shift a lot of the subsidies that are going into pillar one into pillar two to enable and subsidize the transition to this agroecological system. Let's be clear, this transition will lead to losses because you have one system and you need to transition to the other. It requires investments. These are costly. You need new machines. So these costs need to be covered because just as farmers in the developing world, farmers in the developed world, mechanized agriculture, they face the same kind of risks, and they are risk averse. They only will transition if there is a way to overcome the losses that they will face during that transition process.
Okay, I'm sorry, we've run out of time, so just to say quickly thank you to all the panelists, thank you for joining us in the room, and thank you to those joining online, and yeah, fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.